Okay, here we are again. So now let's talk about some findings, right? So there are topics, there are methods, so there also should be findings when it comes to non-financial reporting and the accounting contribution to non-financial reporting research. So let me start with a disclaimer. This is a so rapidly growing literature with so many people contributing from different angles, so that I think it is almost impossible to give a fair balance of whatever the findings are in this field. Also, you will see that there is a lot of variation, a lot of mixed evidence floating around, which is also understandable given that the problems are so interconnected, like we discussed in the last video. If the problems are interconnected and associations are cyclical, then I think we should maybe take a step back from our always big quest to identify clear cause and effect mechanisms, because maybe it's not that easy this time around. So I'm personally not surprised to see that we have a lot of mixed evidence. So what I'm discussing here is based on two relatively recent survey pieces, in large parts, of course, also my own flavor to it, but and these survey pieces, one is by Christensen, Heil, and Lloyds, and the other is by Gravel and Severfeim. And to be fair, both of these pieces are excellent, but they are also a little bit, let's say, biased, or maybe, towards the more economics-based work in this area. And since this is an economics-based course, I think this is fitting. But at the same time, we should acknowledge that what we are discussing now will be a little bit short on the, let's say, on the contributions from other fields to these topics, but I also try to focus on the questions that we as economists normally start to dive on first, right? So, and one of the first things that we do whenever we have a new disclosure regime, we think about, well, what are the incentives, the determinants for disclosure? So, and this is especially fitting when it comes to CSR, because around the globe, this is mostly voluntary. So that means that, we have to understand why firms decide to report. And there is, of course, a very rich body of studies that looks into this. Matter of fact, the body is so rich that here I didn't put a single reference because it would be unfair, right? So there are so many studies that actually look into this that it becomes a little bit of a meta topic even. But these studies have found that there are some covariates that robustly associate both with the decision to report and the quantity and quality of the report, right? So larger firms and firms that are operating in a CSR sensitive or controversial industry are more likely to report. Firms with a dispersed and especially private ownership are more likely to report. Firms with strong governance are more likely to report. Firms where the managers have a positive attribute towards CSR are more likely to report. By the way, this even goes down to the level of whether the CEO has a daughter or not, right? So because at least in Western economies, it seems that daughters are more likely to push their dads or mothers towards socially responsible behavior. So it seems. So and this has been used as an instrument for managerial attitudes. Well, anyhow. So then both managers and firms that experience catastrophes, climate-related catastrophes, are more likely to engage in their reporting. And there's also evidence that stakeholder pressure from various stakeholder groups is actually providing incentives for more CSR reporting. Now, the big problem here in all this is that you have to separate CSR reporting from CSR activities. These are two different things, right? So the first thing is what I do in terms of CSR, and the next thing is whether I choose to report and what I choose to report. So obviously these things are interconnected, but they are different, right? So and for us this is extremely hard because as researchers we can of course only observe these CSR activities over which firms report, right? So this is a connected problem for us. But from a theoretical standpoint, it's clearly two separate questions. And this is important, really important, and also something that I think affects large parts of the literature. And you have to be very careful in reading and evaluating evidence because this interconnectedness. And you can think about this also from a theoretical perspective. And you can think about, let's assume that firms are able to signal their CSR activities, maybe because of assurance or because of the costs of misreporting, something like this. And if this would be feasible, then you could actually imagine that CSR reporting is a more or less fair measure or fair proxy for CSR activities. If, on the other hand, it would be more of a cheap talk problem, then you would observe some greenwashing, right? You would observe firms to actually mimic high CSR activity firms via misreporting, and then it becomes a question of how rational the other side of the market, so the receiver of the information, is. If the receiver of the information would be highly rational, then the receiver should actually be able to foresee that this is a cheap talk problem and would not actually use this information, and then the incentives for greenwashing basically break down, right? So on the other hand, if we believe the receiver to be only actually partly rational or to have some information processing costs or to some behavioral biases, then it becomes more likely that greenwashing actually can be a strategy in equilibrium, so that this might actually be going on. And I think there's also some empirical evidence that we observe greenwashing, at least in some pockets of the market. And that means that CSR reporting and CSR activity clearly are two different things, right? So you can have firms with high quality CSR reporting, but with low quality CSR activities. And this to separate this from each other was a big challenge in the literature. And I think it's also an area where we need more, let's say, specialized focus studies that actually dive deeper into this problem. Okay, so now the next question then also builds on this distinction between CSR activities and CSR reporting, because now we are looking at effects of CSR activities. And of course, this is super broad, and there's much that can be done. That has only very not much to do with accounting, because if you look at CSR activities in itself, then the let's say the measurement and reporting component of it is no longer obvious. Then it becomes more of a general managerial or engineering or whatever question. So, but again, it's very, very interesting, and this is why also people in economics, finance, and accounting, of course, try to contribute to this field. And the basic question is, well, do these CSR activities that firms actually engage in, do they have an effect? So, is there something that we observe? So are they becoming more sustainable? Are they becoming more climate friendly? And does this have an effect on, let's say, firm value, firm profitability, and maybe the whole financial situation of the firm? This is where the finance, econ, accounting people come in. So when you think about the financial consequences of that behavior, when it's just about let's say, do CSR activities lead to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, then this is more of an engineering question, basically, but still interesting, very interesting. So now, when we think about this conceptually, then I think it is worth to read, two papers. One is here, is also cited, Hardin Zingalis in the Journal of Law, Finance, and Accounting, 2017. And there is another paper that is actually closely related by Bertomeu and Tirol in 2010 in Economica, I think. So it's not in the reference list, but easy to find. So these two papers, they look into the question, how can we actually think about firms and the behavior of firms in this new world, if you want, of multiple objectives. And so Hardin Zingalis, they use this terminology shareholder value versus shareholder welfare. And shareholder welfare is a more encompassing concept than shareholder value. Shareholder value predominantly focuses on the future value of present cash flows, whereas shareholder value also factors in all these other aspects of pro-social behavior. And so now, why is this important here is because I think if we want to understand what the effects of CSR activities are, then I think it could be interesting to separate those CSR activities that also create positive net present value from those CSR activities that clearly don't result in positive net present value of future cash flows, but have positive aspects supposedly on other aspects of social behavior, right? So if separating those would be interesting also because it helps us to understand what the effects actually are. Because if there is let's say, a positive effect from CSR activities on firm value, simply because the CSR activities actually also generate net present value projects, then it's not that clear whether it's really the shift to CSR that drives this, or just a firm reacting efficiently to changing investment opportunities, right? So now, when you look into this, there is a relatively recent meta study, a very large meta study by Abs and co-authors, which also looks into this a little bit deeper, and they find a small but positive association of CSR activities with firm profitability. When it comes to the return to portfolios, then this is not that clear. So the effects on firm values are a little bit more fuzzy, right? So, but if you take this and also related meta studies at face value, then you say, well, there seems to be this association, right? But it's extremely hard to make a causal statement based on this. Because if you think about this, the setup that these studies follow, it's basically associative. So it means there is a positive correlation between the two, but whether there is a common cause that drives both remains to be seen, right? And for me, this is relatively likely that we observe a common cause because, first of all, CSR activities are costly, so it might be that they are more likely to be undertaken by firms that have a relatively high profitability. That would be actually a reverse causality issue. Or there is maybe some managerial skills or something else is basically driving both, right? Being profitable in financial terms and also following a CSR-aware strategy because it's the right thing to do, okay? So it's hard to make a causal statement here. I'm not even sure whether the causal statement would be required. So it seems as if at least there's not a clear, obvious trade-off, right? So if you get CSR active, then your bottom line will suffer. This does not seem to be the case. Okay, and then there is another thing which is interesting in that regard, and this is a current study by Bolton Kasperczyk. There are also other studies that look into similar topics, and that's the question whether there is actually something like carbon risk and whether there is an exposure in the asset market on carbon risk. So whether there's actually evidence for firms having a certain climate-related risk that they can be either high or low on, and it seems to be the case. It's always hard in asset pricing to identify these new risk factors, but there is starting to, let's say, compound evidence that this might actually be going on, and that of course would be interesting because then it would become a question of not that much do I want to do CSR activities because this is good for the bottom line or bad for the bottom line. No, but it's also you have to strategize on how to position yourself in this risk factor. Because it is something that investors will value, right? And so it's an interesting area, as I said. But again, take all of this with a huge grain of salt because the literature is so, let's say, manifold and so evolving and also so mixed, on these topics. Okay, now we're looking at a more financial effects of CSR reporting. Right, so CSR reporting is no longer activities. Now we really think about the question, well, does it matter whether you report or not? And this is, of course, not that easy to separate from the activities themselves, right? So we have to be super cautious here. And there's a lot of literature out there that is basically associative and mixed, and it doesn't really... It's not that easy to learn something from it simply because it doesn't also separate the effect of reporting from activities. So I try to focus here on one or two studies that actually look into the question of reporting by design, reporting only. And one interesting study in this case is ENO and Seraphim. They look into the mandatory CSR reporting adoption in China, Denmark, Malaysia, and South Africa. So these were countries that relatively early started with mandatory CSR reporting, and they try to see whether this actually has a value effect. So and they use this introduction as an instrument, and first of all show that this introduction actually has changed the reporting. So this is something that traditional accounting literature often tend to ignore or overlook, but personally I think that this is very important. So if there's a regulatory change, please first show me that it actually changes disclosure. And this is where I think the authors can be applauded because they do this really well. So we see, yes, disclosure changes, and even without assurance, it changes, and the firms are seeking for voluntary assurance. So it really seems, yes, there is something going on in terms of reporting. And then they use this the whole regulation as an instrument in order to test for an effect on top and skew, and they find an effect. So now what is interesting here is, you see, while this study is heavily cited, the original version which uses this as an instrument is still on SSRN, so it's not been published. They have a modified version of this paper that's been published in a handbook just recently, a high quality handbook. And there, if I see this correctly, they no longer use this instrument notion, but instead they're using a propensity score matching approach. Why, I don't completely understand, to be honest, because personally I think the instrument approach is something that makes a lot of sense in this setting. But anyhow, okay, so the joys of the review process, maybe, who knows. Now, there are a bunch of short window studies that actually try to understand short window capital market reactions to CSR reports. And they generally show that there is a reaction in terms of liquidity spikes and also return spikes, but the direction is actually not clear. So it could be that a firm reports, let's say, a certain positively framed CSR activity, but the markets react negatively, and also the other way around, actually. So that what I take from this is that, well, CSR information, report information, moves markets, but it's not always that the market agrees with the direction of, let's say, the sustainability action, which sounds troubling at first glance, but I think it does not, because when you think about this notion of shareholder value versus shareholder welfare, then it might well be that are things that are, let's say, beneficiary in terms of shareholder welfare, but they are not beneficiary in terms of shareholder value. So the stock price declines, but again, maybe even the investors are still happy because they think, yes, this is fair, right? I can live with a little bit of a lower stock price if you are doing something that we believe is good for society, right? So in principle, this whole debate from Hardens and Gales would actually predict that this might happen. Okay, so interesting stuff here. Now there is a relatively recent study by Greval and co-authors on the EU CSR mandate introduction. So it's a very typical design where you use event study, short window market reactions to announcement that a certain regulation will materialize. In these cases, there's always this baseline that a regulation should be priced negatively by the market because it reduces the discretionary freedom of firms. And so that's sort of the baseline assumption. And they also find it here, but they see that this effect is muted for firms that actually already have relatively good CSR reporting or are voluntary CSR reporters. Exactly what you would predict if this overall, let's say, negative baseline holds. So then there is also very limited work on liquidity and risk effects. But again, so liquidity, like all information studies, it's relatively easy to find that actually the market reacts, so liquidity moves. But at the same time, it is unclear whether this is really about, let's say, reporting again, or whether this is also indicative of some, let's say, relation between reporting and activities. And this is particularly the case for the risk effects, because as we've seen on the other slide, the risk effects are maybe more related to the actual activities of firms and less to the reporting. Now, another thing which is interesting, so when we talked about the topics, we also talked about real effects here. And now when it comes to real effects, this is just a highly selective set of studies that I just want to briefly talk about. There are more studies, but I think in principle, I just want to motivate you to think about the real effects in this case, because obviously these are really interesting real effects. So first, there is a study that is still a working paper, but has developed quite a bit over the years, by Fichte and co-authors, and they look into the question whether around the EU disclosure mandate, firms actually change their CSR activities. So here is the question is, does reporting in itself affect activities? So you see clearly two different things. Now, they provide evidence, the authors, that yes, this seems to be the case, and it seems to be the case even prior the actual disclosure requirement. So the firms seem to, let's say, to sum up, ramp up their CSR activities in order to look reasonable when they have to disclose those activities to the investment community. So this is interesting. And then there are two studies that I like a lot because they try to identify relatively precise actions that can actually be measured well, right? So the problem, the Fichte et al. Study is also great, but the problem with these Fichte et al. Type studies is that they use relatively broad outcomes of CSR activities, so rating scores and similar, right? Whereas Rauter and Christensen and co-authors, they actually look into the more refined settings. For example, Rauter looks into extractive industry disclosures. So these extractive industry disclosures have been designed with the intention of a real effect. So this is also being called targeted transparency. So you, as a regulator, you actually impose transparency with a certain real objective in mind. It's not just making sure that information on markets is there and of high quality, but it really, you had an objective. And here the objective of the regulator was they wanted to reduce bribe payments and other illegal activities around extractive industries and extraction right fees, because this seems to be relatively common when, let's say, global corporations interact with local jurisdictions in emerging economies, right? So and Rauter shows that this seems to work a little bit because post this introduction relative to a control group, these extractive industries pay higher extraction fees and also they obtain fewer extraction rights, meaning that they maybe forego some of the more dodgy extraction investments. Okay, and then Christensen and co-authors, they look into a work-related disclosure, so about mine accidents. And there's an interesting thing that these mine accidents had to be disclosed for quite a while, but at some point the SEC said, well, we also want this disclosure to be included within the SEC package. That to some extent changes, let's say, the prominence of these disclosures. And they show that this actually reduced the likelihood of accidents and also caused firms to shut down some of the more dangerous mine facilities, right? Really interesting, I think. So now these examples, these last two examples, I think are good examples for studies that actually really try to identify a cause and effect relationship on a certain specified disclosure. And I think this, I personally, I like this because this really helps us to build some case that there is a role for targeted transparency, if you want. At the same time, obviously, the question always is, well, how does this generalize to more broader disclosure vehicles like CSR reporting as a whole? And I think this is something that will be very interesting to see in the future, whether we can actually bridge these literatures a little bit better. Okay, wonderful. So last thing that I wanted to talk about is, not the second to last thing I have to say. No, it's the last thing actually, CSR measurement, right? So when it comes to CSR measurement, then in the last video, I told you that, hey, this is actually the key area that we accountants should contribute to. And to some extent, it's a little bit frustrating when you look into the literature because actually we don't contribute that much to this area right now. So this is also picked up by Greville and Serafheim in their very nice review. And they say that this is an area where we should do more, but we don't do that much currently. So to be fair, maybe accountants work in that field, but they don't publish academically on it, but rather they contribute to, let's say, the institutions that try to produce and let's say introduce these measures, right? So that might be the case, but I think it would also be good if we as accountants really take this by the horns and try to directly speak to this debate, right? So now, why is this complicated? Well, I hope that you guys already got the idea a little bit here. So it is complicated because it is a multidimensional thing by definition. So sustainability, corporate social responsibility, these things are multidimensional. So they have multiple aspects, and these multiple aspects have multiple, let's say, units, right? So one is metric CO2 equivalent tons, the other is maybe the employee satisfaction, other would be the number of cases where we have human rights issues in our supply chain. All these things are very different in terms of how they are measured and their unit, right? So now again, these measures are also mostly non-monetary, but we have to, as accountants, we have to come up with a way on how these measures can be combined and maybe compared and summarized in a way that actually helps in communication. Because otherwise, it would be that we run the risk that we just overload the receiver with a lot of very complicated information, and then it's unclear whether the receiver would actually start processing this information or whether they would just ignore it because it's too complicated, right? Information processing costs too high. So now, I think Rebel and Seraphim, they use a useful, let's say, a characterization of these measures. They characterize them into principles, input measures, and outcome measures. So, and they also argue that most of the disclosures that we see are either related to principles or to input measures. Input measures means, we spent $20,000 on improving the working condition of our supply chain workers in India. So hopefully it's more than $20,000. But anyhow, so this would be an input measure. An outcome measure would be, the number of human rights related incidents in our supply chain in India reduced from 250 of the last period to only 50 in this period. Okay, so you see that these measures are different in nature, and also maybe the outcome measure would be more interesting, but at the other hand also harder to actually link to the activities of the firm. So in principle, what we would need both. Yeah. So and maybe also a combination of those. Now, last thing on this, you might argue that yes, this is a complex thing, but you would say but there are all these institutions that actually provide these measures. And for example, Asset 4 is a big player, and you might say, Asset 4 provides all these CSR rankings. So perfect. Yeah. So the problem is done, right? I can just use the CSR rankings. So if you think that way, I would very much encourage you to read the study by Beckett and co-authors that actually look into these CSR rankings and try to understand how they co-vary. And the problem is they do co-vary, but they also vary widely. So meaning they are very idiosyncratic. And this, of course, casts some doubts on the quality of these measures and on these rankings. And this is super interesting to read and also super important for us as accountants to actually ponder on, because in the end, what we believe as accountants is that information can change the world, right? So this information should be high quality. It should be good. So if we want all stakeholders of the world to access their power on firm behavior based on this information is better be high quality. Otherwise, it will be all over the place, and people lose trust, and that will be bad. So I think this is a very interesting area to think more about, to read more about, and also to get busy on. So, and what I personally like about it very much is that it almost requires you to interact with researchers from completely different fields, like engineering, natural sciences, legal scholars even. Yeah. So, and I think this can be great. Yeah, it can be very insightful, and you can do something good, right? Isn't that nice? Okay, perfect. So here, normally I don't show you that slide. But this is actually the papers that I talked about, right? So here they are. It's all up for grabs. Do some reading and enjoy. And disclaimer again. So the stuff that I was talking about in this video are mostly econ based work. So I strictly encourage you also to look over the fence to read work from related fields on this. It might be worth an investment from time to time, but it's certainly worth it. So in this case, enjoy. Thanks for watching, and see you in the discussion session meeting. Cheers, bye.